So turn with me in your Bibles to the Gospel of John, chapter 2. And this story only appears in the Gospel of John. You know, there's a number of things that we have in all four Gospels, and the cleansing of the temple is one of those. And then there's some material that's unique to Luke, like the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, and only Matthew and Luke have any reference to the nativity. So the wedding at Cana only appears in the Gospel of John. It goes like this. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they remained there a few days. Okay, now, there's... I'm sorry, what? There's a few things that jump out at you right away. If you do any kind of reading at all on this, there's a lot of scholars that have done work on the days. What does it mean that this is on the third day? And also, what does it mean that this is the 7th day from the time that John the Baptist sees Jesus and so on? I don't know that there's anything really significant going on there. There may be. If there is, if the author of the gospel did that on purpose, to say on the third day, trying to get us who know that Jesus rose on the third day to make that connection, then that's fine. But we don't have any way of knowing that. But what we do know is the symbolism that a wedding has in the New Testament, but also coming from the Old Testament. Does anybody know what that symbolism is? What's the symbolism of the wedding? The consummation of the kingdom. And one of the images of the coming of the Messiah is that there will be a wedding feast, like we say in our communion liturgy. This is a foretaste of the feast to come, the wedding feast which has no end. And that line made it into the marriage service in the Green Book. That the joy of an ordinary earthly wedding is just a little bit of a glimpse, a foretaste of the marriage feast which has no end between the bride and the church. Follow that from the book of Revelation, that image. The other thing is the banquet or party imagery in general. so that you have kind of two different images of the end or the final judgment or the messianic age or the arrival of the Messiah in the Old Testament. And one is the dreadful day of the Lord. And those of us, as particularly that have an attitude where we're looking for the bad guys to get theirs, particularly the Old Testament prophets warn about that and say, well, you want to be careful, because how do you know that you're not going to be on the receiving end of God's judgment? If you are concerned about everybody getting what's coming to them, are you sure that you want to be first in line to get what's coming to you? The other side of it, though, is that when the Messiah comes, when God's kingdom is revealed on earth, the idea is, what's it going to look like? Well, in terms of what we've experienced in this life, what it's most likely going to look like is a banquet or a wedding feast. Now, in our culture, particularly in America, we think that it's time to party all the time, right? You got happy hour just about every day somewhere, right? And I know all of you are very familiar with the happy hours that are available around here. But in the ancient world, for peasant people, something like a wedding feast was one of the few times when people were able to get together, leave behind their workaday kind of world and hardscrabble existence and party. And so that stands out as a significant thing for them. Another image that goes along with that is the image of wine in the Old Testament. The image of vineyard as God's chosen people. God's chosen people are God's vineyard that God cares for, because vineyards in the ancient world, as today, required a significant investment. You know, I served both my internship and 4 years as a senior pastor in the Central Valley in California, in the middle of raisin country. And you know, vineyards require an investment of 5 to 7 years before the vines really start to bear any fruit. And so in the ancient world, to have a vineyard was a significant thing, and wine was a precious commodity. And one of the reasons that wine was a precious commodity, not for necessarily all the reasons that all of you happy hour buffs are thinking of, but the thing about wine was, if you think about food storage, wine was easier to store than milk, you know, other beverages without refrigeration or pasteurization. And so that's one of the reasons that wine was it was a commodity in the ancient world, like olive oil and a lot of other things. And it was also a symbol of God's kingdom, because wine, even though you can make bad wine or good wine depending on your skill, if you think about it, wine is a real gift from God, because everything you need to make wine is on and in the grapes. Now, I don't know if you know this, but I'll tell you anyway. You know, the bloom that's on the grapes, the kind of really fine dust that you can rub off, that has yeast in it. And so when you squeeze the grapes, the juice automatically picks up the yeast from the exterior skin, and then mixed with the sugar that's in the juice, that's how wine ferments. And so the human being manages the process that God has set into motion. And so the image of the Messianic age and the fulfillment of all the promises of God's coming kingdom can be symbolized in the best wine that you've ever had, and a tremendous abundance of that, as much as you want. Okay, so here we have Jesus and his disciples and Mary, his mother, are at this wedding. And they run out of wine. And so one of the really interesting things about this is the exchange that Jesus and his mother have over this. Jesus' mother says they have no wine. And what does Jesus respond? So what? Is that my problem? And how does he talk? How does he talk to Mary?
Kind of sharp, I thought.
Kind of sharp, you know. Again, if you do some research with this, you find out that this is one of those things that doesn't translate very well. Because if you fast forward, and we'll come on this a number of weeks from now, if you know that scene at the crucifixion where Jesus is on the cross dying, excuse me, and Mary and the disciple whom Jesus loved are at the foot of the cross, and Jesus, one of the 7 last words, Jesus says, "Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother." And from that day, the disciple whom Jesus loved took her to his own house. It's the same kind of address. So is Jesus dying on the cross being disrespectful to Mary when he talks to her? No, it's just an idiom. And then the thing about, so what does that have to do with me? Sometimes there are those expressions that just don't translate very well and come across having an edge to them when that's not necessarily what's being said. Now, we're going to come back to a couple alternative explanations, but as we move through this initially, I just want to say that research into Middle Eastern idioms indicate that Jesus probably wasn't being as brusque with her as it may appear in English. Given that, you still have to explain Mary turning to the servants and saying, "Do whatever he tells you."
She ignored him. Yeah.
Like she ignored him, or she knew what he was going to do, whatever. Okay. Now, keep in mind everything that I've said to set up the background, and standing there then were 6 stone jars for Jewish rites of purification. Now, some people make something of the number. What happened after the 6th day of creation? There was the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, which is a day of rest, and so I don't know. But anyway, so there's 6 stone water jars, and each one holds 20 or 30 gallons. Okay? And what were the Jewish rites of purification? Well, it was ceremonial washing. Now that's really important. These people at this time did not have an understanding or view of personal hygiene like we do. They would wash their hands before eating, not like we were told by our mothers or grandmothers to get the dirt off and make sure that your fingernails are clean. How many of you got sent back to scrub under your fingernails because your hands weren't clean enough before dinner? That wasn't a concern for them. In fact, most of, particularly the eye problems that people had in the ancient world went away as soon as people started to wash their hands. So this is not a hygiene thing, it's a ceremonial thing, a washing. And there was even a ritual with the hands where you would cup a hand and make a fist and do this thing where you moved your fist around inside the cup that you made with your hand. And so it's ceremonial washing as a religious ritual. Now, keep in mind that particularly in the Gospels, but in the New Testament, but particularly in the Gospels, Jesus is concerned always that any of those outward rituals are connected first and foremost, primarily, to where you are in relationship to God and other people. Okay? We're going to come back to that. But this stuff is there for the Jewish rites of purification. So Jesus says, fill the jars with water. Now, if there's 6 of them, and they each hold 20 or 30 gallons, how much liquid are we talking about? Quite a bit. Quite a bit. Between 120 and 180 gallons. That'll fuel your party. That's right, Sam knows. So they fill them to the brim. And he says, now draw some out. So they ladle some out and take it to the chief steward. This is like the caterer, the toastmaster, whatever, the guy that's in charge of the banquet. So they take this ladle to him, and you can imagine how upset he is that they've run out of wine. And so he tastes the water now become wine, and what does he say? Wow.
Pretty good stuff.
Pretty good stuff. And says he doesn't know where it came from, but they got it. Let's keep the party going. Everybody serves the good wine first until what? Everybody gets hammered, then you bring out the ripple. Or how many of you remember ripple? That's those 2. Wow, okay. Thunderbird?
They're just not holding up their hands.
They're just not holding up their hands. Thunderbird?
Yeah.
How about Valley High? Okay, Donna. All right. But you have kept the good wine until now. Okay, now. What does this mean? What does this mean? Well, what does it say about Jesus? What does it say about Jesus that he turned water into wine? And not only that, but that it's the best wine that the steward has ever tasted. What does it say about Jesus? His talents were wasted on being a carpenter. Should have been. No. It says something about Jesus in terms of the Messiah, the messianic expectations about Jesus and his relationship with God, about Jesus and his appearance in relation to the fulfillment of the coming kingdom of God, the long-promised coming kingdom of God. Okay? Now let's back up and dig a little deeper in a couple different directions. How many of you come from church backgrounds that were teetotaler, where you're not supposed to drink? Okay. All right. So what do you do? What do you do with Jesus and his disciples not just being at a wedding where everybody is knocking them back, but then Jesus making between 120 and 180 gallons of the best wine that the caterer had ever tasted? What do you do with that?
Grape juice.
Say it was grape juice. We'll get back to that. You drink it. Who said that? Who said you drink it? Okay, very nice. That's a true Lutheran, Episcopalian, or Roman Catholic response. Knock it back. Thank you, Jesus. I'll have another. Okay. One thing that you can say is that, well, that was before the crucifixion and resurrection. And then once Jesus was crucified and resurrected, because he said to the disciples, I think it's in Mark's version of the Last Supper, I won't eat of the fruit of the vine again until I'm in the kingdom with all of you. So that's when Jesus declared no more alcoholic beverages. So Jesus turns from keep the party going to party pooper, right? That's one response. Another response is that this wasn't actually wine. And in fact, there's somebody who, and I heard a version of this in all seriousness when I was in college from somebody who was part of a really severe group that believed that Jesus was a teetotaler. And the idea was that knowing that grape juice will automatically ferment, and by the way, it wasn't until Mr. Welch perfected the process of pasteurization as applied to grape juice that you could have grape juice. Because grape juice will automatically ferment no matter what you do unless you stop that process artificially by intervening with pasteurization, essentially. And so can you imagine where Mr. Welch came out on Jesus as the teetotaler debate? Well, of course, Mr. Welch said that you had to have grape juice for communion because Jesus would never drink wine for communion. Did Mr. Welch have any selfish personal interest in promoting that? Just maybe. Now, the other thing was, there was somebody that did a thing that said actually what they did was they did this kind of raisin paste. They did this raisin paste, and then whenever they wanted to drink a grape-based beverage, they added water to the raisin paste and made this delicious concoction. So I have a book by Francis Capone, Robert Farrar Capone, sorry, who substitutes raisin paste for wine. So they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, now draw some out, take it to the chief steward. So they took it. When the chief steward tasted the raisin paste that had the water that had become raisin paste and did not know where it came from, he said, everyone serves the good raisin paste first and then the inferior raisin paste after the guests have become drunk.
Yeah, no.
No, that doesn't work. So you can see, but you've kept the good raisin paste till now. You're not thinking that's funny at all, are you? The other thing that I heard from this guy when I was in college was that they would make this kind of goop out of grapes and then reconstitute it with water. What? Yeah.
But didn't they drink more wine back then because the water was not always that good?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You know, that's a good excuse, right? To have a pitcher of margaritas instead. The water here might be bad, right? Tortilla flats.
Yeah, they still do.
Yeah, they still do. No, you're right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Jackie. You're absolutely right. That's been, and they also mixed water with wine.
Yeah. Because it was a very strong wine.
Right. So, anyway, the whole point is, it's really hard to push this. Now, I'll give you another reading that I had not come across this until preparing for today. But, okay, it says in verse 2 that Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. But there are a few scholars that want to argue that no, that they really weren't invited. What that really means is that they crashed the party, Jesus and his disciples, however many were with him. So the implication is that Jesus and the disciples crashed the party and really knocked back the wine, and they were responsible for it running out.
Oh, you're kidding.
All right, now it gets better.
Sounds like a cow.
It gets better. So then Mary, how do your mothers feel if you overindulge? So then Mary sees that Jesus and his disciples have no manners at all because, first of all, they crashed the thing, then they're drinking up all the wine. Jesus is tipsy, and Mary says, they have no wine. Thanks to you, they're out of wine. Okay?
Sounds like a mother.
Sounds like a mother. So then, to make good on it, to make up for it, then Jesus turns water into wine. How do you like that for a Bible study?
Sounds like
I mean, I don't know where that kind of reading comes from. Okay, and I just share that to say, you know, for whatever reason, if you want to twist things around, first of all, to say that Jesus really didn't drink wine and really didn't turn water into wine, I'm sorry. That seems like that's really a hard thing to pull off. Okay? And then the other side of it is, if you want to make Jesus and the disciples out to be overindulgent, so then I think that's a problem also. Okay? Any questions or comments on that much? Yeah, Joyce?
My comment is, from the time he was 12 until this, when he starts his ministry in 30, nobody knows anything about what he did. And of course, some of the religions that some of you might be have explained some things, that, oh, he did this when he was a carpenter or whatever. But it says to me that when she goes up to him and says, you know, we need wine, she knows that he is capable of doing some miracles. But that's all I can gather out of what you told us.
And based on what? I mean, you know, as always, there's just all kinds of mystery, and there's more questions raised than our answer. Okay? So, you've kept the good wine till now. How many of you know what one of the things, anyway, that Martin Luther said about this passage? Anybody? Well, you know that there are some people who would say that marriage isn't just a bed of roses. Some people would say that. And so Luther said that from time to time, when you're married, the wine runs out. And the party stops. And so then what do you do? What do you do? What?
You call Jesus in.
You call Jesus in.
Fix it.
So then what Martin Luther said was, one of the things that we learn from this story is that when your marriage hits a dry period, that you need to go to Christ when the wine runs out. To quote the marriage service, we can have our joy restored. And I thought that was not, nobody had heard that before?
No.
Yeah.
No Lutheran pastor had said that at any of your weddings? You probably can't remember what anybody said when you got married. One of the things I learned really early on is nobody listens to the pastor at a wedding.
I listened and they said, I plight thee my troth, and I didn't know what the heck that meant.
Does anybody know what that means? Plight thee my troth?
Troth.
Yeah.
It means that, and with my body worship, what it means, that old language, what it means is when you plight your troth, it means that you bring everything that you are, everything that you have, to the relationship and put it on the table. It means you don't hold anything back. Now they tell you, huh?
Yeah, 50 years later.
So, 50 years later. All right. Now, okay. What does it mean that this is the first of Jesus' signs? What does it mean that it's the first of Jesus' signs?
Isn't this the
His
first
divinity,
miracle that he
it's the
did?
start of his divinity.
Yeah, okay, as an expression of his divinity. What, Jackie?
Wasn't this his first miracle that he did?
Well, that's what it says here.
Yeah.
So my question is, what does it mean that his first miracle is changing water into wine? What does that say about Jesus' divinity?
He is the Messiah.
Yeah.
Or he has superpowers.
Well, but also how about the wineskins? You know, the wine going into old wineskins, they burst versus new wine? Or is that too much of a stretch?
Yeah, that's too much of a stretch.
What about the wedding?
What about the wedding? Do you understand the question? I mean, if you're a Messiah, and you have all of this power, what would you expect might be the first miracle?
Something small.
Something small,
Yeah.
like
What a way to start.
something small, like somebody says, "Where's the remote?" and Jesus says, "It's under the couch cushion."
I would remove it.
Doesn't it show his interest in us as a people?
Okay.
As part of our whole life, wanting to be participating in everything that we do.
Okay, did everybody hear what she said? Can you say it again louder?
Well, just that he wants to be in every part of our life. And that's where he wants to be. And so he went to the wedding and he was with all these people, part of the whole group. But then he had an opportunity to show his divinity.
In an ordinary human occasion, by changing water into wine, which is a sign of the kingdom and messianic expectation. What kind of a Messiah keeps the party going? What does that say about God?
Joyful.
God is joyful. Okay, that's pretty significant. That's a pretty significant statement if you think about it. Yeah.
When he says to his mother, "My time has not come yet," and yet he goes ahead because she
Right.
tells the story. But I mean,
That's problematic because does anybody know, as John tells the story, when Jesus' hour is really going to come?
It's gotta be when he's crucified.
It's got to be when he's crucified. You're absolutely right.
Or the resurrection.
So his hour comes when he's crucified in the Gospel of John. And one of the things that we'll learn is it's not the resurrection, it has to be the crucifixion, because if it's not the crucifixion, then the bad guys win. There's this whole thing in the Gospel of John about how, whether it's Caiaphas or Pilate, they think they're in charge, they think they win, but they don't. They don't, because even in killing Jesus, he is being glorified. And his hour comes. But you don't have to take my word for it. We'll get there. Okay? All right, so the whole point of kind of pushing this is the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Okay, now, what did they believe? Okay, this guy changes water into wine. What do you believe about somebody who changes water into wine?
Pretty special.
Pretty special, magician. My point is, and we're going to see this over and over again, what is it ultimately that God is after? What is saving faith in Jesus? Is saving faith in Jesus believing, yeah, he could churn water into wine? Is that saving faith?
No.
Recognizing that Jesus has powers? No, you're right. You know, and this Sunday or Saturday, if you come to church a little later, the gospel lesson for this week is from John 14. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you. That's the gospel lesson for today. What is saving faith? in Jesus. That's a slippery thing. I would say that at this point, a better translation of this would be his disciples think that they believed in him.
Because they doubted him after that many times.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so now, just to kind of finish up this section then, in verse 12, it says, after this, he went down to Capernaum with who?
His mother.
His mother.
His mother and
His
brothers.
his brothers
That's a whole other ballgame.
and his disciples. Okay, now, where did the brothers come from?
Yeah.
They must have been at the wedding.
They must have been at the wedding.
With the mother.
Where did the brothers come from? If you're a Roman Catholic,
Yeah, there is no brothers.
and you've got the Jerusalem Bible, the translation from Hebrew and Greek in French, and then into English, what do you do with that verse?
Throw it out.
You throw it out. You cut out the brothers part because you're invested in maintaining that Mary is a perpetual virgin and didn't have any other children besides Jesus. And so if those are brothers, it means half-brothers, it means step-brothers from Joseph's previous marriage. Okay? But again, why mention that Jesus had brothers and not explain that? Or is it, as some other Roman Catholic scholars have interpreted to mean, it is a modifier on the disciples? It means his brothers, his disciples.
Is this the only place that it mentions brothers?
No.
Well, in Mark, there's his family thinks he's gone nuts, and there's other mentions. Okay, so they stay there a few days. All right, before we move to the cleansing of the temple, anything else on the changing water into wine, the wedding at Cana?
I think Mary was ready for Jesus to declare himself as to who he was. Because she didn't pay attention to him when he said, no, it's not my time yet. And like a typical mother, there was no option there. The decision has been made. I'm going to out you.
Yeah. Well, you might be right. You might be right. Again, how comfortable are certain parts of Christendom with describing Mary as a typical mother? I'll give you a hint.
None.
Not Mary. Okay. Yeah.
But Mary knew in the very beginning that Jesus was going to be something special, that he was a gift from God.
Yeah, what exactly did Mary know? And when did she know it?
When she got told she's having a baby.
Yeah.
Well, but, I'm sorry, what?
When the angel came to her. Yeah.
Okay, but my question is, what specific, so did Mary know everything that was going to happen in the next 33 years?
No.
Okay.
She knew that he was
She
special.
took him to the temple.
Okay, she took him to the temple and some mysterious people said some words over him. What exactly did Mary know and when did she know it?
She knew it then because they said it would make her heart.
Okay, but what exactly did she know?
She knew there was something bad coming.
Okay. Did she know specifically what that bad was going to be? Or what the good was going to be?
No.
Okay. All right, anything else about this? Okay, now the cleansing of the temple. Now, as I said before, one of the difficulties with this story is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is one of the stories that we have in all four Gospels. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where does it take place?
At the end.
At the end. In fact, in the Gospel of Mark, chapters 11 and 12, for instance, there's really significant things that happen in terms of the story being set up for Jesus' entry into Jerusalem and then what we call the Passion. And so in the Gospel of Mark, for instance, they go into Jerusalem the night before around the temple. Jesus kind of scopes things out, and then after the triumphal entry, then he goes in and cleanses the temple. The thing about the cleansing of the temple in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that seems to be the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of the chief priests and the Sanhedrin and the scribes and the Pharisees deciding that Jesus needs to die. Okay? We'll see in John's gospel, it's the raising of Lazarus that seems to do that. And instead of having the cleansing of the temple at the end of Jesus' ministry, just a few days before he is crucified, here in the Gospel of John, where does it take place? Right at the beginning. Right at the beginning. And if you follow the traditional timeline, this would be at the beginning of Jesus' 3-year ministry rather than at the end of Jesus' 3-year ministry. So, the Passover of the Jews was near. Does everybody, yeah, Sam?
Before you get to that, he was in Capernaum at that time when he went down to Jerusalem. It says right here,
Yeah.
Passover, then Jesus went to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Working with thousands of kids in my line of work with coaching and being in shape and this kind of thing, it always was mind-boggling to me, but that they passed things over and they got up and went to so-and-so.
Uh-huh.
Or they went to Jerusalem, like it says here. Does anybody have an idea how far it is from Capernaum to
They're not
Jerusalem?
far.
It's
They're
80
not.
miles.
It's what?
80 miles.
Oh,
And you were talking about a day. Is a day the same back then? as it is
Yeah.
now? Well, there was
It'd be way north.
reading through chapter 2 here and into 3 and on to 4, they travel over 300 miles. And they're traveling from Jerusalem to Capernaum and up to Cana and back down to Jerusalem again. And I used to always just make a joke out of it that they all get on a bus and go.
Like Jesus, the movie
They walk.
Jesus Christ
They have to
Superstar.
walk. Now, can you imagine in scriptures and they always pass over this so fast, that here he is teaching 2,000 people in one place, and they all got up and traveled to so-and-so. Now, can you imagine that trip from there to there, like 80 miles is nothing to us.
Right, and this looks like, according to my Bible and a map in the back, it looks to me like it's just about somewhere between 80 but less than 100 from Capernaum to Jerusalem.
Yeah, I got a ruler out one year.
Okay.
And I don't know where it was.
And so your point is it would be about a week's journey by foot, maybe a little more if you were
according to that,
less, if you were pushing
about
it.
20 days, he did all of this, 318 miles. They walked from,
You mean he went from Cana?
just getting over into chapter 3,
And
they go back and forth and back and forth, and it's just always made me wonder, well, do people really realize how in shape those people must have been?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
No wonder they
It's
live
a lot of
years
walking.
old.
Okay. Okay, anything else on that? All right. So, does everybody know where the Passover comes from?
Yeah. the
Book of
angel.
Exodus? Okay.
Egypt.
So, that's important. So they're in Jerusalem and the Passover is near. So Jesus goes into the temple and what does he find? People selling cattle, sheep, and doves. Because you had to have, those animals for the temple cult, and then also specifically for Passover. And the other thing is that your Roman currency, which one of the things that the Romans instituted was a monetary system, and so you weren't allowed any longer after you were conquered by the Romans and occupied. You weren't allowed to do your own money.
You weren't allowed to what?
Do your own money. Had to be Roman currency, which, because it had a picture of the emperor on it, it was idolatrous and could not be carried on to the temple grounds. All right, now, that means that there was a good reason, so to speak, because we don't want to carry something that's unclean and idolatrous on to sacred ground, the temple grounds. So we have to exchange Roman currency for temple currency, which the Jews got permission from the Roman authorities to continue to mint and use on temple property. Now, if you had to have animals to celebrate the Passover, and specifically to celebrate the Passover, you had to have enough lamb about the size of a walnut or a golf ball, so that they didn't eat as much meat as we do. But to celebrate the Passover, everybody needed to have a portion of lamb that was at least as large as about a walnut or a golf ball. Okay, so these two tables of people could go together on a lamb and do that. All right, now, what do you suppose happened over time, but maybe immediately, but over time, in terms of the tables where you exchange Roman currency for temple currency, and the places where you buy the temple certified animals for worship? What do you suppose happened?
Closer and
A little
closer.
profit was being made.
A little profit was being made. Right. You remember, anybody remember the first time you ever went to Bank One Ballpark or Chase or whatever it's called right now? See the difference between McDonald's in the ballpark and, okay, or, my brother, younger brother's quite a sports fan. He lived in Arizona at the time, and I didn't see this, but evidently, your average beer at what was then Bank One Ballpark was $8. And they did this breakout on what each 50 cents in that $8, where each of those 50-cent pieces went in that breakdown. Okay, so we all know then what happened at the temple in Jerusalem was that it's like organized crime. It's like the mafia. What's the key to being in the mafia? You figure out any place where money is changing hands and you get in the middle of the transaction. And then you manipulate it. Okay? So, you know what happened at the temple. People are there to worship God, to celebrate the Passover, and there has to be an exchange of funds. A literal monetary exchange of Roman currency for temple currency, and you need to buy animals for sacrifice. Like Jesus' parents did, they bought turtle doves, 2 for a penny, to sacrifice when Jesus was circumcised. Okay? And they were poor people, that's what they could afford. Rich people could afford other animals for a bigger, more impressive sacrifice. But either way, you were at the mercy of 2 different exchange rates. The currency rate and what the animals cost. Okay? So what is it that Jesus is objecting to? Jesus is objecting to people who use the temple cult, the celebration of Passover, as a way of not just making a living, but as a way of cashing in. So he makes a whip from cords. He drives the animals out. He tips the tables over. Now, does Jesus say, no more of this? Or is Jesus saying, stop ripping people off?
He alludes to.
Don't make my father's house a marketplace.
He alludes to.
Okay, and so
He's gonna build it again.
what's he saying about that, Donna? Stop exchanging money and stop sacrificing animals?
Just there, just not there.
Just not there? Sacrifice animals at home?
He says, stop making my father's house a market. Doesn't say not to do it.
Well, does it say that he's going to become the sacrifice soon and it's not going to be needed anymore?
Does he say that?
No.
He says, and destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.
When does he say that?
When they ask him what sign.
When they ask for a sign. Ruth?
My understanding of this is Jesus said, stop making a marketplace of my temple. This is a place of worship. You're not supposed to be doing all this stuff in here.
Right.
At that time, this is where they face God.
Anybody grow up in a church where you couldn't have bazaars and anything on church grounds? Because,
Oh,
or you all came from churches where the money changers just ran wild.
We never did, but I never knew why.
Well, okay. The church that my parents still go to, St. John in Vancouver, Washington, Missouri Synod, where I was confirmed. And one of the tussles in the long history of that congregation is that they had some pastors who would not allow the women's group to sell quilts or anything like that, to raise money for any reason because of the money changers in the temple. All right, now one of those pastors who kind of held that line, but was one of the ones who was much beloved for his ministry, when he retired, he and his wife came back to that community and that church, and he was a pretty impressive woodworking hobbyist. And he made some pectoral crosses, and I have one. And I wear it, and it's coming up, I'll wear it on Pentecost because it's a cross with a dove set on top of it. It's very nice, everything. But Pastor Wildermuth sold those at church. And there were a number of women who were old enough to either remember personally or their mothers or grandmothers having fits and, saying things behind his back, along with the other pastors who wouldn't let them even sell quilts to give the money to the Braille group or whatever. So, whether or not that's what this is about, it says something again about whether or not your heart is in the right place. Now, if we think, and not just to pick on the church where I was confirmed and my parents still belong, but I'll bet that all of us here in this room this morning can point to things along the way, maybe some even in this congregation, that are representative of misplaced enthusiasm for certain things. Like, have we ever been in a congregation where people were more concerned about how the ushers did things rather than why and for whom the ushers did things. You ever hear the Garrison Keillor thing about the usher team from the church in Lake Wobegon goes to the usher competition in Minneapolis? Because you gotta function like a precision drill team. Or how about being a communion assistant? Do we ever get more concerned about how we do communion than why we do communion and what it's all about? When I was at Grace and we did expanded the pancake breakfast, we weren't really prepared. And so one of the methods that had been developed for doing pancake batter was to get a 5-gallon bucket and an electric drill with a paint stirrer and do 5 gallons of pancake batter. And if you're feeding 250 or 300 people and they're coming back for seconds and thirds, how many pancakes do you make? How many times do you have to do that? Well, so that really worked pretty well. And then the drill burned out. So then one of the congregations that was involved right away got a new drill and had the new drill at church, and after about 2 weeks it got stolen. Yeah. So sin abounds, so grace can more abound. So then we had a number of things like that happened, and ended up having a commercial mixer donated by a group of people at Peace Lutheran Church in Peoria. So the Lord takes away, and then the Lord really gives. And then there were always issues about how the grills were maintained and all of this kind of stuff. And so one of the things about being a pastor is you always get pushed in the middle of those things. I don't volunteer. Where's the conflict that I can go get in the middle of? And so that I can get in the middle of 5 people and have them all upset with me rather than upset with each other. So what I kept saying was, the most important thing is that we are able to feed the people that come for pancakes. It's not, the precise method or all of that, but the most important thing is that we feed people on Sunday morning. You would have thought that I landed from a spaceship and had green. I mean, that makes pretty good sense, doesn't it? But it's just to illustrate how easy it is for us to lose focus. And so what's happened during the time of Jesus is people have lost focus in Jerusalem at the temple as to what that's all about. As to what that's all about. Now, then the whole point of reading the story is not to say shame on those people 2,000 years ago or whoever anywhere. The whole point of the story is to look at myself and ask myself the question, when it comes to things having to do with my relationship with God, do I ever get lost? Do my priorities get out of whack? Do I lose focus?
I have a thing
Yeah,
about that.
Joyce.
This is kind of silly, I know, but being Lutheran all my life, it was, the wine is Jesus' blood and bread. And so twice in my life, once was we were outdoors, and this minister was very casual, and we were going to have, it was a margin cone, I believe, or a circle or whatever, and he put the wine on the ground, the little cup. And I looked at him and I felt bad. because I was, I was so indoctrinated
Mhm.
that this was Jesus' blood. And the second time is, I used to serve on the committee, the community committee in our church in West Covina. And they said, you cannot put the wine that hasn't been used, because we used to have a pitcher in those days, not the individual glass. You can't put it down the drain. You have to put it in the ground.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And it still says that.
Does it still say that?
Oh, yeah.
The altar guild.
So was I going over,
No, there
feeling
are a
bad?
lot of, how many of you have done altar guild at a church where there was a specific sink that drained out into the flower bed?
No.
And so you only put wine in that special sink, and what do you do with the consecrated host? Take it out and put it on the bushes so the birds can eat it.
Oh.
There are some people get really upset if a church uses disposable cups. Some people get really upset at church assemblies or conventions where you have to commune a whole bunch of people and you use disposable cups and they hold or they have a garbage bag. And then, you hear it all. I get that. When I was in seminary, Toivo Harjumpa, who was Finnish, and one of the things he did in his ministry was he was chaplain to the Bishop of Finland and was very high church. Like all the way up the candle for Lutherans. Which, by the way, here at Our Savior's, it's pretty much down at the base of the candle. But Toivo was way up, way high church. And on communion days in the chapel at the PLTS campus in Berkeley, and we used a lot of, loaves, not hosts. And so there were crumbs everywhere from breaking the bread and serving communion. Toivo, after worship, would get on his hands and knees and walk around, pick it all up, and then he would kneel and he'd eat it. And, from a certain point of view, you can say, well, that's kind of extreme. But I know for a fact that he would have done that whether anybody was there. And, he wasn't doing it to impress anybody. It's because he really believed that you needed to behave a certain way. And when those of us, my class in seminary, the class of 81, was the first class not to have him for liturgics. And everybody all the classes before thought that they walked a little higher off the ground than we did because they had Father Toivo for liturgics. But anyway, we had this thing called integrative seminar where you would meet for an hour and whatever every Wednesday morning and try and integrate what you're learning in the classroom with your experiences in teaching parish. And there was one of my good friends Toivo was in the group, and they were talking about how they do communion in some of these congregations that we were out in the Bay Area. And there was one congregation where over time they used real bread, but the altar guild had an electric knife. They cut the top off the loaf, and then they cut the heart of the bread out of the loaf, and then cut it up into cubes, put it back in, and put the top of the loaf back on, and they used that for communion. Well, when Father Toivo had asked Virgil, how do they do it? I think it was at Pleasant Hill or whatever it was. He was talking about, they get an electric knife and they cut the loaf up. Well, Father Toivo thought, he had this image of the presiding minister
Oh, no.
After the consecration, serving communion, cutting the loaf with an electric knife, the body of Christ given, the body of Christ given for you. They had to pull him down off the ceiling. Because the pastor of that congregation had gone to PLTS and had TOEFL for liturgics, and he was thinking, how could he have gone so far off the reservation? Okay, now, when Jesus cleanses the temple, one of the things that's interesting is the Jews then said to him, what sign can you show us for doing this? They didn't say, this is the way we've always done it. They didn't say, we can't have a temple cult without money changing and people buying animals. They didn't try to defend what they were doing. Now, that's always stuck with me. But they say, what sign can you show us for where you get off doing this? Now, one of the reasons is, if you read the prophets, what do the prophets have to say generally about what goes on in the temple? Speaking on God's behalf. I abhor your feasts and your solemn celebration. God says, your worship makes me sick. I don't care what you do. You don't have any real piety. How does God know? Because of the way that widows and orphans are treated? Because you don't care about those that are hungry and starving and needy? So I don't care what you do with your great big choir and your pipe organ. I don't care, because it's not connected to a day-to-day life of real piety. Now that's what you find in the prophets. So I'm thinking these people know that there have always been these prophets who think that God isn't real happy with what we do here in the temple. So what kind of sign do you have to show us where you get off doing this? There isn't an answer to the question, but I think the sign is the cleansing of the temple. The fact that somebody finally comes in, turns over the tables, drives out the animals, and says, this is wrong. That's the sign. And it's completely consistent with what you find in Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos especially, Micah, Hosea. Name the prophets. They all take some swings at what goes on in the temple. Now, when we talk about our worship being misplaced and losing sight of the true purpose and all of that kind of stuff, you don't have to point fingers at chancel prancers. Do you know what chancel prancer pastors are?
No. No.
Chancel prancer pastors are ones that do things, to show off. The most important thing is how I dress up in my robes and prance around. Okay? Now, do you know what I'm talking about? I don't ever do that. Right? Okay. I'm talking about just going through the motions. So now let's look at that one. Anybody here ever realize that you sat through an hour of worship and just kind of went through the motions? No?
Sure.
Sure. Or even things like, we said the Lord's Prayer, but it's just like, have you ever driven home from work or whatever and realized that your mind was someplace else and you were on automatic pilot behind the wheel? You ever been sitting in there and on automatic pilot?
Yeah.
Now, what is that? Does that mean you're a bad person?
No.
Does that mean your salvation's in danger?
No.
Hope not.
It just means that we need to keep focus. And we need to maintain our priorities. And we need to remember what is most important about worship. So, Jesus is giving a pretty stark reminder. And in the answer to the question, who do you think that you are? He says, destroy this temple and in 3 days it'll rise again. They thought he was talking about Herod's remodeling and expansion project, which took 46 years. But they didn't get it. And it was only until after, in verse 22 it says, after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Go back then to verse 11. Jesus did this, the first of his signs, at Cana in Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. But it was only after he was resurrected that they understood maybe a little bit what was going on with the cleansing of the temple. So what's the point of that? Well, the point of that is that we're in a journey of faith. How many times in your life have you been disappointed that something happened the way that it did? But then a little further down the road you look back and you say, boy, God was really looking out for me. Okay? In my own life, there have been 3 different times when I was in a call process and interviewed with a congregation and they went with somebody else and my feelings were hurt and I felt rejected and I thought I was really disappointed until a little while later. And then I said, thank you, Jesus. Anybody else have any experiences like that? How many times do you get a little distance from something and you're able to look back and you have gratitude? Or you have clarity and understanding about something? Okay? So the disciples, this is happening with the disciples over and over again. Now, we don't have any details to verse 23. Again, this whole thing about there's always background, there's always questions that are left unanswered. When Jesus was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the signs he was doing. What signs was he doing? We don't know. Verse 24. But Jesus, on his part, would not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people, and he needed no one to testify about anyone, for he himself knew what was in everyone. Now that's going to come up again. What is Jesus talking about there?
God knows what we're doing all the time. God knows what we're doing all the time, so, and Jesus being part of the Trinity.
Well,
Anybody surprised at what happened to the temple with the money changers and the animal sellers? That's the first time we ever heard of anything like that. That's the first time we ever heard of anybody taking advantage of any country folk coming into town for the fair. That's the first time we ever heard of anybody taking advantage of anybody else when a dollar was involved. Really? What is it that Jesus knows is inside each one of us? Okay, how sinful human nature is. That's a really good Lutheran answer. And in fact, anybody know what the small catechism language would be about what's inside each one of us?
Yeah.
The old Adam. Anybody ever hear of that?
Yeah.
Oh, now you remember from confirmation, right? The old Adam, which has to be drowned every day in the waters of baptism. Because the old Adam rears its ugly head and wants to jump in the driver's seat and get in charge of the money exchange window and the animal concession. Why? Because there's money to be made. At whose expense? Well, it doesn't matter. You know, Sam bounces into town, falls off a pumpkin truck. That's his own fault. If he doesn't know. If he doesn't know any better. I mean, that's the con artist's rationale, right? What is it that Jesus knows is inside each of us?
Well, it's just like Peter, said, I would never, never deny you, and then right away he does it again. Same thing is true for each of us, as
Right.
far as we are very changeable.
Okay. So let's put it this way. Jesus knows that each of those people in Jerusalem need to be there at the temple celebrating Passover. Why? Because they need to know. They need to know that God includes them in the family of faith. Why do all of us need to be here?
For that
Yeah,
reason.
same here, same reason.
Same thing. I mean, we need to have, Luther talked about the old Adam needing to be drowned because we all have that. Right? Is it possible that from time to time we lose sight of the fact that we're here for a reason? We're not here in the sanctuary to be looking at how other people are behaving. We're not here in the sanctuary to be counting how many light bulbs are burned out. Or for any other reason than we need to be here because we need to be here. And we need to hear the gospel. And that's it. Period. And the fact that we need to be reminded of that, the fact that we can lose sight of that, the fact that we can get miles and miles off course, is testimony to the fact that we need to be here. Okay, that's it for today. Anything else before we go? All right, are we meeting next week?
No.
No, we're not.
Always question.